Name is Abigail Mercer. I'm 32 years old. I was standing at the kitchen sink washing the last of the Thanksgiving dishes when my brother walked in, dropped a manila envelope on the counter next to my elbow, and said, "Open it. We finally figured out why you've always been different." 14 family members in the living room. My aunt's famous pecan pie still warm on the counter. My father's voice carrying from the other room, mid-story, making everyone laugh. And my brother standing there with his arms crossed, waiting for me to fall apart. I dried my hands slowly on the dish towel. I looked at the envelope. And then I looked at him. "I've been waiting 3 years for this moment," I said, "but not for the reason you think." I reached into the bag I'd left on the kitchen chair and pulled out a brown accordion folder, rubber banded shut, worn at the corners from 2 years of careful handling. His smile flickered. "Just slightly. Sit down, Trevor," I said, "and go get Dad. Let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up at 4 Birchwood Court in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Tri-level house, attached garage, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knows your last name and your business. My father, Howard Mercer, owned Mercer Heating and Cooling, a company his father had started in 1971. By the time I was born, it had 22 employees and contracts with half the commercial buildings downtown. We were comfortable. More than comfortable. We had a lake house in Minnesota we used every August. My brother and I had our own rooms, our own bathrooms, our own phone lines in high school. Except I wasn't really we. Let me explain how the Mercer family worked. My brother Trevor was 4 years older than me. Stocky, sandy-haired, easy smile. From the time he was 12, my father took him to job sites on weekends, taught him how to read blueprints, let him sit in on client meetings. He started working summers at the company at 16. By the time I was in middle school, it was already understood. The way certain things in families just become understood, without anyone ever saying them out loud. That Trevor would inherit Mercer Heating and Cooling. That it was his. My mother, Donna, was a part-time bookkeeper for my father's business. She was warm and distracted, and a little overwhelmed most of the time. She loved me, I knew that. But she loved me the way you love something you're not quite sure how to hold. Gently, carefully, from a slight distance. And then there was my father. Howard Mercer was the kind of man who filled a room without trying. Big laugh, firm handshake, remembered everybody's name. He coached Trevor's Little League team. He went to every single one of Trevor's football games, home and away, junior varsity and varsity. He had a photo of Trevor in his company truck, one on his desk at work, one on the refrigerator at home. There was no photo of me in his truck. I figured this out slowly, the way children figure out the things adults don't say directly. Little things, first. The way he'd clap Trevor on the shoulder at dinner and say, "Good game, son," and then look at me like he'd briefly forgotten I was there. The way he never came to my school plays, but always had a reason that sounded reasonable. Work, a client dinner, a late bid that had to go out. The way he talked about the business at dinner like Trevor and my mother were the only ones at the table. I was 10 years old the first time I heard him say it out loud. We were at my Uncle Pete's house for a 4th of July cookout. I was getting a soda from the cooler on the back porch when I heard my father's voice through the screen door. He was talking to my uncle, low and private, the way men talk when they think no one's listening. "Trevor's solid," my father said. "Sharp kid. Going to be ready to take over sooner than I thought." My uncle said something I couldn't make out. "Abigail." A pause. "She's fine. She's a good kid." Another pause, longer. "She just doesn't feel like mine, Pete. Never has." I don't know how else to say it. I stood there with a can of Sprite in my hand and didn't move for a long time. I didn't cry. I was 10 years old and I had already learned, somehow, that crying about things like this only made them worse. I went back inside and ate a hot dog and watched the fireworks and said nothing. But I didn't forget. I spent the next several years paying very close attention. I noticed that my father never asked about my grades unless they were bad. I noticed that when I was accepted to the University of Iowa's nursing program, he said, "That's good," and changed the subject back to a job Trevor had just landed. I noticed that when Trevor bought his first house at 26, My father co-signed the loan and threw a barbecue to celebrate. When I graduated and moved into an apartment in Des Moines, my father helped me load the moving truck and left before we finished. He had somewhere to be. I built a life anyway. Quietly, the way I'd always done things. I became a pediatric nurse at Blank Children's Hospital in Des Moines. I had a small apartment on Ingersoll Avenue with a fire escape I'd turned into a container garden. I had friends I loved, a rotation of Sunday morning farmers markets, a savings account I'd been feeding carefully since my first real paycheck. I came home for holidays. I cooked. I cleaned up. I listened to Trevor talk about the business and my father beam at him across the table. I drove back to Des Moines on Sunday afternoons and told myself it was fine. It was not fine. But I was good at pretending. The thing that changed everything started on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 4 years ago. I was on my lunch break at the hospital eating a turkey sandwich in the break room when my phone rang. Unknown number. Iowa area code. Is this Abigail Mercer? It is. My name is Connie Aldrich. I was your mother's college roommate at Iowa State, class of 1989. A pause. I've been trying to decide whether to call you for about 2 years. Your mother passed away last spring and her voice caught slightly. There's something I think you should know, something she asked me to tell you, if anything ever happened to her. My mother had died 14 months earlier. Ovarian cancer, 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I'd taken a leave from work and moved back to Cedar Falls for those 7 weeks. I sat with her every day. I held her hand through the treatments that stopped working almost immediately. I was there the night she died, in the blue recliner beside her hospital bed while my father and Trevor slept at home. She had said something to me in those last days. Something I'd filed away as morphine and grief. And the strange confessions dying people make. She'd taken my hand and looked at me with those clear, exhausted eyes and said, "There are things your father believes that aren't true. I need you to know that I loved your father and I was faithful to him. I was always faithful to him." She'd squeezed my hand. Connie knows. If you ever need to know the whole truth, Connie knows. I'd thought she was confused. I hadn't written it down. I hadn't looked for a Connie. And then Connie called me. We arranged to meet 2 weeks later at a diner called Goldie's on Lincoln Way in Ames. I drove up on a Saturday morning in April. The place smelled like coffee and bacon grease and something baked. I got there first and took a corner booth. Connie Aldrich was 61 years old, gray-streaked hair pulled back, reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She looked like someone's favorite teacher. She sat down across from me and didn't waste time. "Your mother and I were roommates for 2 years and close friends for 30 after that," she said. "So I want you to understand that what I'm about to tell you, I'm telling you because she asked me to, not because I want to cause trouble." "Okay," I said. "Your father had an affair. It started in 1991, the year before you were born. And it went on for almost 3 years." She held my gaze steadily. "With a woman named Renee Garlock. She was a sales rep for one of his equipment suppliers." I didn't say anything. "Your mother found out when she was pregnant with you. She confronted your father, and he—" Connie stopped. Picked up her coffee mug, set it back down. "He told her that since she'd clearly been unfaithful too, they'd call it even and never speak of it again. My mother wasn't unfaithful. No, she wasn't. I know that for a fact. I was her closest friend for 30 years and I know who she was." Connie's voice was quiet but firm. "But your father had convinced himself she must have been to justify what he'd done. And when you were born and he looked at you and didn't see himself clearly, he kept believing it. Or he chose to. I was never sure which." The diner noise went on around us. Someone's kid was laughing at the counter. A bell rang in the kitchen. "He told people," I said. It wasn't a question. He told his brother. He told at least one friend from the business. I heard things over the years through your mother. She never argued with him publicly. She just tried to keep the peace." Connie looked down at her hands. She was ashamed that she couldn't fix it. That she couldn't make him see. I told her for 20 years that she needed to get a DNA test, that she needed to make him face the truth. But she was afraid. Afraid of what would happen to the family. Afraid of what he'd do with the business. A pause. Afraid he'd leave. I thought about my mother, all those years, making herself small so the household would stay intact. Protecting me the only way she knew how, which was to stay. Is there anything else? I asked. Connie reached into her purse and pulled out a plain white envelope. Your mother gave me this 8 years ago. She said to give it to you if she died before she could tell you herself. I opened it at the table. Inside was a single sheet of her stationery, pale green with a small flower at the top corner and a key taped to the bottom of the page. The letter said, Abby, if you're reading this, I ran out of time. I'm sorry, I should have fought harder for you. There's a safe deposit box at First Midwest Bank on Collins Road. Box number 114. The key is attached. I put things in there you'll need if you ever decide to find out the truth for yourself. Whatever you decide, I love you. I always loved you exactly as you were. Mom. I drove to First Midwest Bank on Collins Road 2 days later. I had to bring my mother's death certificate and my own ID and sign 3 forms. The box was small, standard bank size. Inside, a folded document from a company called Genetically Yours, out of Omaha, Nebraska, dated 2009. A paternity test. My mother had done it herself, 15 years before I ever thought to look. She had submitted her own DNA and mine. The test compared us to my father's hair, which she'd collected without him knowing. Alleged father, Howard Dale Mercer. Child, Abigail Jean Mercer. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. I was his daughter. I had always been his daughter. There was also a handwritten note my mother had paperclipped to the front page. He knows I did this test. I showed it to him in 2009. He looked at it for a long time and then he handed it back to me and said he wasn't sure he believed the results. He walked out of the room. He never brought it up again. I don't know how to explain a man who chooses doubt over evidence. I gave up trying. I sat in my car in the First Midwest Bank parking lot for 45 minutes. My mother had shown him proof, and he had shrugged it off. Not because he genuinely didn't believe it. Because believing it would mean he owed me an apology. And Howard Mercer, in all my 32 years, had never once apologized to anyone for anything. I drove back to Des Moines. I called Connie that night and thanked her. I didn't tell anyone else what I'd found. Instead, I made a plan. I ordered my own DNA test from a company called Helix Ancestry Lab, based in Chicago. Professional, legally defensible, chain of custody documentation. It cost $380 and I paid for it with the savings account I'd been building since my first nursing paycheck. I submitted my own sample easily. Getting my father's was harder. Cedar Falls has a Mercer Heating and Cooling Company picnic every August. 40 employees, families, my dad doing his politician routine, shaking hands and telling the same 4 stories he'd been telling since 1998. I came home for it. I smiled. I helped set up folding tables and served potato salad and listened to Trevor give a little speech about the company's record year. My father drank 2 bottles of Bud Light and left his second one on the tailgate of his truck when he went to talk to a client. I walked past, dropped my sunglasses on the ground next to the truck, bent to pick them up. 30 seconds. A fresh Ziploc bag from my pocket. Done. I drove back to Des Moines that Sunday afternoon and FedExed the samples to Helix Ancestry Lab on Monday morning. 3 weeks later, the results came back on a Wednesday. I was eating leftover soup at my kitchen table, still in scrubs from a 12-hour shift. My email pinged at 7:43 in the evening. Helix Ancestry Lab, report ID HAL 2222. Alleged father, Howard D. Hall 222. Alleged father, Howard D. Mercer. Child, Abigail J. Mercer. Child, Abigail J. Mercer. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on the table and finished my soup. I washed my bowl. I stood at the window for a while, looking at the Ingersoll Avenue traffic. Then I sat back down and I started building the file. Not because I was ready to use it, because I needed to understand the complete picture before I did anything at all. I made a folder on my laptop, password protected, backed up to 2 external drives. I scanned every document, my own DNA results, my mother's 2009 test, her letter, the first Midwest Bank documents. I printed hard copies, put them in archival sleeves, stored them in an accordion folder in the back of my closet, behind my winter coats. I wasn't ready yet. There were still gaps. My father's sister, my Aunt Lorraine, lived 20 minutes from me in Ankeny. We'd always been closer than I was with anyone else in the family. She was 12 years younger than my father, sharp and funny and refreshingly blunt about the Mercer family's particular brand of dysfunction. I took her to lunch at a Thai place on Hubel Avenue and told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I always wondered." "Wondered what?" "Your father told Pete about Donna cheating," Pete told me, "but it never sat right." She turned her water glass slowly on the tablecloth. "I knew your mother. She wasn't like that. And the way your dad talked about it, it was like he was trying too hard to make everyone believe it." She looked up. "Did you know he told your grandmother?" "I hadn't known that." "She believed him," Lorraine said. "She was in her 80s and he was her son and she believed him. She felt sorry for him." A pause. "She was cold to you at the end, before she passed. I always thought that was why. So it had gone further than I realized. Further than Uncle Pete. His own mother. His own mother had looked at me and seen a lie he'd invented." I drove home that afternoon with my hands tight on the steering wheel. Lorraine called me 6 weeks later. "Dad left me something," she said. "In with the stuff from Grandma's house when we cleaned it out last fall. I didn't know what it was at the time, but I opened it last week." Her voice was careful. "It's a letter. From your mom to your grandmother. Dated 2011. She was begging her to look at the DNA results. She mailed Grandma a copy of the test." Lorraine's voice cracked slightly. "Grandma wrote 'unreliable' on the front page in pencil and put it in a drawer. My grandmother had held proof in her hands and written one word on it and put it away. I asked Lorraine to mail it to me. She did. I added it to the accordion folder. My grandmother had died 4 years ago. My mother had died 14 months ago. The people who had done the most damage, and the person who had suffered the most, were all gone. The only people left were my father, my brother, a folder of evidence, and me. I thought about that for a long time. About when and whether and how, and then Thanksgiving came and Trevor made the decision for me. He'd found out about the folder. I didn't know how. Maybe Aunt Lorraine had said something without meaning to. Maybe he'd overheard a phone call. But 3 days before Thanksgiving, he called me. "I know you've been digging around," he said, "in the family stuff, talking to Lorraine, God knows what else." His voice was flat and certain, the way it always was when he'd already decided how a conversation would go. "Dad's not well. His blood pressure's been bad. The last thing he needs is you stirring things up, because you've always had some kind of complex about not being included." "A complex," I said. "You know what I mean. You always felt left out." "Some of that's in your head, Abby." "Is it?" "Just leave it alone," he said. "Come to Thanksgiving, be normal, and let the man have some peace." I said I'd be there. I spent the 2 weeks before Thanksgiving getting everything in order. I had the accordion folder laminated and organized. DNA results on top, my own test first, then my mother's 2009 test, then my mother's letter to me, then the copy of her letter to my grandmother with "unreliable" penciled across the top in my grandmother's handwriting. Then the Aunt Lorraine documentation, her signed statement of what she'd told me. I put everything in a large brown accordion folder, rubber banded shut. I put the folder in my canvas work bag. I packed my bag in my car 2 nights before Thanksgiving. I drove to Cedar Falls on Thanksgiving morning, clear sky, 34 degrees, frost still on the grass at the highway rest stops. I pulled onto Birchwood Court at 11:15 in the morning. My father's truck in the driveway, Trevor's SUV at the curb. Smoke from the chimney. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. I carried my bag inside. Trevor was in the living room watching the Macy's parade. His wife Dana was setting the table. My father was in his recliner with a cup of coffee and the newspaper. "Hey, Abby," my father said without looking up. Hi, Dad. Good drive? Fine. Roads were clear. He turned a page of the newspaper. That was it. That was the whole greeting. I went to the kitchen and I started cooking. That was how it always went. Dana set the table and Trevor watched football, and my father read the newspaper, and I cooked Thanksgiving dinner: roast turkey, cornbread stuffing, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce from scratch, rolls. I had been making this meal since I was 22 years old. The first year, my mother had stood beside me and talked me through the turkey. Every year since, I'd done it alone. At 2 o'clock, Aunt Lorraine arrived with her husband, and then Uncle Pete and his wife, and then my father's neighbor Dale with his wife, and then Trevor's college friend and his girlfriend who were passing through and had nowhere to go. 14 people total. The table was set with the good china my mother had picked out 20 years ago. I carried everything to the table at 4. Turkey, stuffing, potatoes, all of it. I sat at the end closest to the kitchen, the same seat I had occupied at every Mercer family holiday for 32 years. My father said grace. He thanked God for family, for another year, for the business doing well. Trevor talked about a new commercial contract, a school district in Waterloo that had just signed. My father beamed. Uncle Pete talked about his retirement, 18 months away. Lorraine made everyone laugh with a story about her neighbor's dog. Nobody asked what was new with me. Nobody asked about the hospital. Nobody asked about my apartment, my life, my garden on the fire escape. Trevor's wife Dana asked if I was seeing anyone, but in the way people ask when they're filling a conversational pause, rather than actually wanting to know. I refilled water glasses. I got up twice to retrieve things from the kitchen. I cleared plates between courses. At 5:30, I went to the kitchen to get the pie. I'd made 2, apple and pumpkin, my mother's recipes, the ones she'd made every year. That was when Trevor came in behind me. He had the manila envelope in his hand, blue and white logo, a consumer DNA kit from one of those ancestry companies, the kind you buy at Target. Before pie, he said, "I've got something." He was smiling, that particular smile he had when he was about to do something he'd decided was funny. Ancestry project. I had everyone in the family do one over the summer, Dad and me and Dana, and I got one for you too, Abby. He held the envelope toward me. Mom always said we had some German in us, but nobody could ever figure out the details. Might answer some questions about why you're so different from the rest of us. He left the pause just long enough. Different, I said. He shrugged with his whole face. You know, you've just always seemed like you came from somewhere else. No offense. He glanced back toward the dining room, and I could hear that a few people had gone quiet, listening. Maybe this will finally give you some answers. I looked at the envelope. I thought about my mother in room 42012 at the hospital, holding my hand, telling me she was faithful. I thought about her driving to First Midwest Bank in 2009 with a sealed tube and her husband's hair. I thought about the word unreliable penciled on a letter she'd spent weeks writing. I picked up my bag from the kitchen chair. I pulled out the accordion folder. I set the folder on the counter between us. Trevor's smile went uncertain. I already have my answers, I said. I've had them for 2 years, but I appreciate the thought. I walked past him into the dining room. 14 faces turned toward me. My father looked up from his wine glass. I set the accordion folder on the table. I pulled off the rubber band. I looked at my father. I want to show you something, Dad. He put his wine glass down slowly. Abby. I've been patient, I said. I've been patient my whole life, but Trevor brought it up at the dinner table, so we're going to talk about it at the dinner table. I pulled the first document from the folder. Helix Ancestry Lab, official letterhead, chain of custody seal. I laid it on the table in front of my father. He looked down at it, his jaw tightened. Probability of paternity, I said, loud enough for the table to hear, 99.97%. I am your daughter. I have always been your daughter. Lorraine made a small sound. Uncle Pete went very still. That's... Trevor started. I'm not finished. I pulled the second document. This is a test my mother ran in 2009. Same result. She showed it to you. I looked at my father. She showed it to you and you told her you weren't sure you believed it. My father's face had gone a particular shade of gray. She showed it to Grandma too. I pulled the third sheet, my mother's letter to my grandmother, the copy with the penciled word across the top. I held it up so the table could see. Grandma wrote unreliable on it and put it in a drawer. My aunt's husband cleared his throat. Dana had pressed her hand over her mouth. Trevor stood in the doorway. I heard you, I said to my father. I was 10 years old at Uncle Pete's 4th of July, and I was getting a soda from the cooler, and you told him I didn't feel like yours? My voice was steady. It surprised me how steady it was. I was 10. And I spent the next 22 years wondering what I'd done wrong. My father opened his mouth. Nothing came out. You ran a company your whole life by being exact, I said. Numbers, contracts, measurements. You never signed off on a bid without double-checking the figures. But when your own wife handed you a scientific document with a 99.97% result, you chose not to believe it. I looked at him for a long moment. That wasn't doubt. That was a decision. Trevor said, "Dad, say something." My father looked at the documents. His hands were flat on the table. He didn't speak. "I'm not asking you to apologize tonight," I said. "I'm not asking for anything tonight, but I need everyone in this room to know the truth." I looked around the table. At Uncle Pete, who had heard a lie at a 4th of July cookout and carried it forward. At Lorraine, who had always quietly known but never said it out loud. At Dana, who looked like she'd never been told any of this. At Trevor, who had walked into a kitchen 30 minutes ago thinking this would go differently. "Mom never cheated on you," I said to my father. "She was faithful to you her whole life. She loved you in a way you did not deserve. And she spent 30 years trying to protect everyone in this room from having to know what you chose to believe instead." I gathered the documents back into the folder. I rubber-banded it shut. I picked up my bag. "The pie is on the counter," I said. "Apple and pumpkin, Mom's recipes." I put on my coat. I picked up my car keys. My father's voice came out rough and low. "Abigail." I stopped. I didn't turn around. "I know where to find you," I said. "If you ever want to have a real conversation, I'm not hard to reach. But I'm not going to keep showing up and cooking dinner and pretending everything is fine." I walked to the door. I did that for 32 years. I'm done. I drove south on I-38 with the heat on and the radio off. It was dark by the time I reached the Des Moines city limits, the skyline lights reflecting off the river as I came across the bridge. I called Aunt Lorraine from the parking lot of my apartment building. She picked up on the second ring. "You okay?" she said. "Yes," I said. And I meant it. "Your father didn't say a word after you left. Just sat there." Pete eventually asked if he was all right, and he said he needed some air and went outside. A pause. "He was out there a long time." "Okay." "Trevor's angry. He called it a stunt." "I know he will." "I'm not angry," Lorraine said. "I should have said something a long time ago. I'm sorry I didn't." "You told me the truth when I needed it," I said. "That matters." I went upstairs. I watered my fire escape plants even though it was dark and cold, because I needed something to do with my hands. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table with the accordion folder in front of me and thought about my mother in a bank parking lot in 2009, holding a document that should have changed everything, driving home to a man who had chosen not to believe it. She had done the hard work. She had gathered the proof. She just hadn't had the moment. Or maybe she'd never been given one. I had made my own moment. The messages started before I'd finished my tea. Trevor, 7:48 p.m. That was incredibly selfish. Dad is 67 years old with blood pressure issues, and you ambushed him in front of family. I hope you're proud of yourself. Trevor, 9:12 p.m. You want to talk about this like adults, call me. My father, 10:35 p.m. Call me. 2 words. Same command energy he'd used my entire life, like I was still the daughter who could be summoned. I didn't reply. There were other messages too. Dana, Trevor's wife, the next morning. I didn't know any of that. About your mom's test, about any of it. Trevor never told me. I just wanted you to know that I heard you, and I'm sorry for the ways I went along with things without questioning them. I'd like to talk sometime if you're open to it. Uncle Pete. 2 days later. Voicemail. Abby. It's your Uncle Pete. I've been sitting with this for 2 days and I feel sick. I heard what your father told me all those years ago, and I never questioned it. I never should have carried that. I'm sorry I did. Your mother was a good woman and she deserved better from all of us. Call me when you're ready. 5 people reached out in that first week. Dana. Uncle Pete. Lorraine again. A longer call. A cousin of my father's who had been at a Christmas party years ago where my father had made a comment about my paternity in front of her, who'd thought about it ever since. A woman who had worked with my mother at the company books for a decade, who had always thought something wasn't right. 5 people. More than I'd expected. More than I'd ever had. Cedar Falls talked. Of course it did. It always had. Mercer, heating and cooling, had been in that town for 50 years. Howard Mercer's name was on a plaque at the Chamber of Commerce, on a sponsorship banner at the Little League field where he'd coached Trevor in 1998. People knew him. And now people knew this. I didn't post anything online. I didn't call anyone. I simply stopped performing. I stopped being the Mercer daughter who showed up and cooked and kept the peace, and pretended the seating arrangements at the dinner table were just coincidence. I stopped being the presence that made the family look whole. Without me there to absorb it, the structure became visible. By January, 3 longtime employees at Mercer Heating and Cooling had asked uncomfortable questions at a company meeting. By February, my father had started working half-days. Trevor called me twice more, voicemails I listened to and didn't return. The first was angry. The second was quieter, shorter. He said he'd been thinking. He said maybe they needed to talk. I called him back for that one. We met for coffee at a place on Ingersoll, neutral ground, halfway between his life and mine. He came in looking like he hadn't been sleeping well. We talked for 2 hours. He didn't have a lot of excuses by the end of it. He said he'd known their father made comments about me. He said he'd told himself it was just the way Dad was. Just his personality, not something to get involved in. He said he had not thought about what it felt like from my side, not really, not ever. That was hard for him to say. I could see it cost him something. I didn't forgive everything over 1 cup of coffee. I wasn't interested in pretending we were fine. But I said I was willing to try to build something honest, if he was. He said he was. We're figuring out what that looks like. My father hasn't called again since that first text. I've thought about what I'd say if he did. I've turned it over and over. The man is 67 years old and he has spent 3 decades choosing a story that cost his daughter 32 years of wondering what was wrong with her. I don't know if he's capable of saying the true thing out loud. I don't know if he knows how, but I made myself a promise at my kitchen table the night I drove home from Cedar Falls. I was going to stop waiting for permission to exist fully in my own life. I was going to stop making myself convenient. That was 8 months ago. Last spring, I used some of the money I'd been saving to put a down payment on a small house in Beaverdale, a quiet neighborhood in Des Moines with big trees and front porches, and a yard where I can finally have a real garden instead of a fire escape full of containers. 3 bedrooms, good bones. The inspector said the furnace was old and I'd need to replace it within 2 years. I signed the papers anyway. I'm not calling Mercer Heating and Cooling. I also set up a small fund through the hospital foundation. It's not large, maybe $12,000 to start, with a plan to add to it each year. It supports pediatric patients who need extended stays and whose families are traveling from more than 2 hours away, covering parking, meals, the things insurance doesn't touch, the costs that break people when they're already broken. I named it after my mother. People ask me sometimes whether I regret how Thanksgiving went, whether I should have handled it differently, quietly, privately, without the audience. I think about my mother mailing a letter to my grandmother. I think about her walking into First Midwest Bank with a tube and her husband's hair. I think about her sitting across from my father with a document that said 99.97% and watching him hand it back. She tried quiet, she tried private, she tried for 30 years. I needed witnesses, not to humiliate anyone, to make the truth something that existed outside my own head, in a room full of people who could no longer pretend they hadn't heard it. Here's what I know now, at 32, after everything. My father did not treat me badly because he had any real reason to doubt me. He treated me badly because I was inconvenient evidence of something he had done and then refused to face. Every time he looked at me and felt distance, that distance was his own. I was never the problem. I was the mirror. And here is the thing about living as someone else's inconvenient truth for 32 years, you get very good at taking care of yourself. You get good at being self-sufficient and resourceful and not needing the room's approval. Those aren't small things. My mother gave me those things even in her silence. She stayed, and her staying kept me fed and housed and loved in the only way she knew how to offer. I carry her recipes. I carry her handwriting on green stationery. I carry the image of her in a bank parking lot in 2009, doing the only thing she could think to do. I go to her grave on November 15th every year, the anniversary of the night she died. I bring flowers from my garden. I sit for a while. I tell her what's growing. If any part of this story stayed with you, I'd be grateful if you subscribed and left a comment. I read every single one. If you know someone carrying their own accordion folder, waiting for the right moment, tell them to trust themselves. The moment will come, and when it does, you'll be ready. I've thought about cause and effect a lot since that Thanksgiving, not in any mystical sense, just the plain mechanical way that choices compound over time until they become something unavoidable. My father made a choice in the early 1990s. He had an affair, and when my mother found out, he did something that I think was almost worse than the affair itself. He reversed it. He pointed the accusation back at her, made her the guilty one, and then lived inside that version of events for 32 years. That choice didn't stay small. It grew. It shaped how he looked at me at the dinner table. It shaped what Trevor absorbed without ever being told directly. It shaped my grandmother penciling one word on a letter and filing it away. One man's refusal to face himself turned into a structure that an entire family lived inside without questioning it. That's not fate. That's just math. What I keep coming back to is my mother. She had the evidence in 2009. She drove to that bank, she did the work. She sat across from my father with a document that said 99.97%, and he handed it back. She could have left. She could have gone to a lawyer, gone to her brother, gone public in whatever way 2009 allowed. She didn't, and I spent a long time being frustrated by that, if I'm honest, wishing she'd fought louder. But I've gotten to a different place with it. She made the choice she was capable of making at the time she was in. She was a woman in a small Iowa town whose husband owned the most recognized business in the county, and she was afraid. That's not weakness. That's a person navigating the actual constraints of her actual life. What she did instead was leave a key in a safe deposit box. She made sure Connie had her number. She planted the truth in places where it could survive her. That took a kind of quiet intelligence that I don't think gets enough credit. I think about that when I think about what it means to act with integrity. It's not always a grand gesture in front of witnesses. Sometimes it's a woman putting a document in a fireproof box and writing a letter on green stationery, just in case. The moral weight of what she did didn't show up until years after she was gone. But it showed up. For me, the lesson isn't really about my father. I stopped expecting things from him a while ago. The lesson is about what happens when you decide to stop absorbing other people's dishonesty as though it's your own problem to manage. For 32 years, I cooked their dinners and drove home on Sunday afternoons and told myself it was fine. That patience wasn't virtue, it was avoidance. The real act of courage wasn't the Thanksgiving folder. It was the 2 years before it, when I quietly gathered the truth piece by piece without asking anyone's permission or waiting for someone to hand it to me. That's the thing I'd want anyone to take from this. The intelligence to ask hard questions. The discipline to build your case before you act. The resilience to walk out of a room without looking back when you know you've told the truth. None of that came from anywhere outside me. It came from years of being overlooked and deciding that being overlooked was not the same as being wrong. My mother named me Abigail. It means My father's joy. I used to think that was cruel irony. Now I think she named me what she hoped for. She was an optimist until the end. I'm still working on that part.